"We're printing that poem of yours in next month's Antichrist," said Ravelston from his first-floor window. Gordon, on the pavement below, affected to have forgotten the poem that Ravelston was speaking about. He remembered it intimately, of course, as he remembered all his poems. "Which poem?" he said. "The one about the dying prostitute. We thought it was rather successful." Gordon laughed, a laugh of gratified conceit, and managed to pass it off as a laugh of sardonic amusement. "Aha, a dying prostitute. That's rather what you might call one of my subjects. I'll do you one about an Aspidistra next time." Ravelston's oversensitive, boyish face, framed by nice dark brown hair, drew back a little from the window. "It's intolerably cold," he said. "You'd better come up and have some food or something." "No, you come down. I've had dinner. Let's go to a pub and have some beer." "All right, then. Half a minute while I get my shoes on." They had been talking for some minutes, Gordon on the pavement, Ravelston leaning out of the window above. Gordon had announced his arrival not by knocking at the door, but by throwing a pebble against the window-pane. He never, if he could help it, set foot inside Ravelston's flat. There was something in the atmosphere of the flat that upset him and made him feel mean, dirty, and out of place. It was so overwhelmingly, though unconsciously, upper class. Only in the street or in a pub could he feel himself approximately Ravelston's equal. It would have astonished Ravelston to learn that his four-roomed flat, which he thought of as a poky little place, had this effect upon Gordon. To Ravelston, living in the wilds of Regent's Park was practically the same thing as living in the slums. He had chosen to live there, en bon socialiste, precisely as your social snob will live in a mews in Mayfair for the sake of the W.I. on his notepaper. It was part of a lifelong attempt to escape from his own class and become, as it were, an honorary member of the proletariat. Like all such attempts, it was foredoomed to failure. No rich man ever succeeds in disguising himself as a poor man, for money, like murder, will out. On the street door there was a brass plate inscribed P.W.H. Ravelston, Antichrist. Ravelston lived on the first floor, and the editorial offices of Antichrist were downstairs. Antichrist was a middle to highbrow monthly, socialist in a vehement but ill-defined way. In general, it gave the impression of being edited by an ardent nonconformist who had transferred his allegiance from God to Marx, and in doing so had got mixed up with a gang of vers libre poets. This was not really Ravelston's character. Merely he was softer-hearted than an editor ought to be, and consequently was at the mercy of his contributors. Practically anything got printed in Antichrist if Ravelston suspected that its author was starving. Ravelston appeared a moment later, hatless and pulling on a pair of gauntlet gloves. You could tell him at a glance for a rich young man. He wore the uniform of the moneyed intelligentsia, an old tweed coat. But it was one of those coats which have been made by a good tailor and grow more aristocratic as they grow older. Very loose grey flannel bags, a grey pullover, much worn brown shoes. He made a point of going everywhere, even to fashionable houses and expensive restaurants, in these clothes, just to show his contempt for upper-class conventions. He did not fully realize that it is only the upper class who can do these things. Though he was a year older than Gordon, he looked much younger. He was very tall, with a lean, wide-shouldered body and the typical lounging grace of the upper-class youth. There was something curiously apologetic in his movements, and in the expression of his face. He seemed always in the act of stepping out of somebody else's way. When expressing an opinion, he would rub his nose with the back of his left forefinger. The truth was that in every moment of his life he was apologizing tacitly for the largeness of his income. You could make him uncomfortable as easily by reminding him that he was rich as you could make Gordon by reminding him that he was poor. "You've had dinner, I gather," said Ravelston, in his rather Bloomsbury voice. "Yes, ages ago. Haven't you?" "Oh, yes, certainly. Oh, quite." It was 8:20, and Gordon had had no food since midday. Neither had Ravelston. Gordon did not know that Ravelston was hungry, but Ravelston knew that Gordon was hungry, and Gordon knew that Ravelston knew it. Nevertheless, each saw good reason for pretending not to be hungry. They seldom or never had meals together. Gordon would not let Ravelston buy his meals for him, and for himself he could not afford to go to restaurants, not even to a Lyon or an ABC. This was Monday, and he had 5 and 9 pence left. He might afford a couple of pints at a pub, but not a proper meal. When he and Ravelston met, it was always agreed, with silent manoeuvrings, that they should do nothing that involved spending money, beyond the shilling or so one spends in a pub. In this way, the fiction was kept up that there was no serious difference in their incomes. Gordon sidled closer to Ravelston as they started down the pavement. He would have taken his arm, only of course one can't do that kind of thing. Beside Ravelston's taller, comelier figure, he looked frail, fretful, and miserably shabby. He adored Ravelston, and was never quite at ease in his presence. Ravelston had not merely the charm of manner, but also a kind of fundamental decency, a graceful attitude to life, which Gordon scarcely encountered elsewhere. Undoubtedly it was bound up with the fact that Ravelston was rich, for money buys all virtues. Money suffereth long and is kind, is not puffed up, doth not behave unseemly, seeketh not her own. But in some ways, Ravelston was not even like a moneyed person. The fatty degeneration of spirit which goes with wealth had missed him, or he had escaped it by a conscious effort. Indeed, his whole life was a struggle to escape it. It was for this reason that he gave up his time and a large part of his income to editing an unpopular socialist monthly. And apart from Antichrist, money flowed from him in all directions. A tribe of cadgers, ranging from poets to pavement artists, browsed upon him unceasingly. For himself he lived upon 800 a year or thereabouts. Even of this income he was acutely ashamed. It was not, he realized, exactly a proletarian income, but he had never learned to get along on less. 800 a year was a minimum living wage to him, as £2 a week was to Gordon. "How is your work getting on?" said Ravelston presently. "Oh, as usual, it's a drowsy kind of job. Swapping back-chat with old hens about Hugh Walpole. I don't object to it." "I meant your own work, your writing. Is London Pleasures getting along all right?" "Oh, Christ, don't speak of it. It's turning my hair grey." "Isn't it going forward at all?" "My books don't go forward, they go backward." Ravelston sighed. As editor of Antichrist, he was so used to encouraging despondent poets that it had become a second nature to him. He did not need telling why Gordon couldn't write, and why all poets nowadays can't write, and why, when they do write, it is something as arid as the rattling of a pea inside a big drum. He said, with sympathetic gloom, "Of course I admit this isn't a hopeful age to write poetry in." "You bet it isn't." Gordon kicked his heel against the pavement. He wished that London Pleasures had not been mentioned. It brought back to him the memory of his mean, cold bedroom and the grimy papers littered under the Aspidistra. He said abruptly, "This writing business, what B.S. it all is. Sitting in a corner, torturing a nerve which won't even respond any longer. And who wants poetry nowadays? Training performing fleas would be useful by comparison." "Still, you oughtn't let yourself be discouraged. After all, you do produce something, which is more than one can say for a lot of poets nowadays. There was Mice, for instance." "Oh, Mice. It makes me spew to think of it." He thought with loathing of that sneaky little foolscap octavo, those 40 or 50 drab dead little poems, each like a little abortion in its labelled jar. Exceptional promise, the Times-lit Sup had said. 153 copies sold, and the rest remaindered. He had one of those moments of contempt and even horror which every artist has at times when he thinks of his own work. "It's dead," he said. "Dead as a blasted fetus in a bottle." "Oh, well, I suppose that happens to most books. You can't expect an enormous sale for poetry nowadays. There's too much competition." "I didn't mean that. I meant the poems themselves are dead. There's no life in them. Everything I write is like that. Lifeless, gutless. Not necessarily ugly or vulgar, but dead, just dead." The word dead re-echoed in his mind, setting up its own train of thought. He added, "My poems are dead because I'm dead. You're dead. We're all dead. Dead people in a dead world." Ravelston murmured agreement, with a curious air of guilt. And now they were off upon their favourite subject. Gordon's favourite subject, anyway. The futility, the bloodiness, the deathliness of modern life. They never met without talking for at least half an hour in this vein, but it always made Ravelston feel rather uncomfortable. In a way, of course, he knew. It was precisely this that Antichrist existed to point out, that life under a decaying capitalism is deathly and meaningless. But this knowledge was only theoretical. You can't really feel that kind of thing when your income is $800 a year. Most of the time, when he wasn't thinking of coal miners, Chinese junk coolies, and the unemployed in Middlesbrough, he felt that life was pretty good fun. Moreover, he had the naive belief that in a little while socialism was going to put things right. Gordon always seemed to him to exaggerate. So there was subtle disagreement between them which Ravelston was too good-mannered to press home. But with Gordon it was different. Gordon's income was £2 a week. Therefore, the hatred of modern life, the desire to see our money civilization blown to hell by bombs, was a thing he genuinely felt. They were walking southward, down a darkish, meanly decent residential street, with a few shuttered shops. From a hoarding on the blank end of a house, the yard-wide face of Roland Butter simpered, pallid in the lamplight. Gordon caught a glimpse of a withering Aspidistra in the lower window. London. Mile after mile of mean, lonely houses, let off in flats and single rooms. Not homes, not communities, just clusters of meaningless lives, drifting in a sort of drowsy chaos to the grave. He saw men as corpses walking. The thought that he was merely objectifying his own inner misery hardly troubled him. His mind went back to Wednesday afternoon, when he had desired to hear the enemy aeroplanes zooming over London. He caught Ravelston's arm, and paused to gesticulate at the Roland Butter poster. "Look at that bloody thing up there. Look at it. Just look at it. Doesn't it make you spew?" "It's aesthetically offensive, I grant, but I don't see that it matters very greatly." "Of course it matters. Having the town plastered with things like that." "Oh, well, it's merely a temporary phenomenon. Capitalism is in its last phase. I doubt whether it's worth worrying about." "But there's more in it than that. Just look at that fellow's face gaping down at us. You can see our whole civilization written there, the imbecility, the emptiness, the desolation. You can't look at it without thinking of French letters and machine guns. Do you know that the other day I was actually wishing war would break out? I was longing for it, praying for it almost." "Of course the trouble is, you see, that about half the young men in Europe are wishing the same thing." "Let's hope they are. Then perhaps it'll happen." "My dear old chap, no. Once is enough, surely." Gordon walked on fretfully. "This life we live nowadays, it's not life. It's stagnation, death in life. Look at all these bloody houses, and the meaningless people inside them. Sometimes I think we're all corpses, just rotting upright." "But where you make your mistake, don't you see, is in talking as if this was incurable. This is only something that's got to happen before the proletariat take over. Oh, socialism, don't talk to me about socialism. You ought to read Marx, Gordon, you really ought. Then you'd realize that this is only a phase. It can't go on forever." "Can't it? It feels as if it was going on forever." "It's merely that we're in a bad moment. We've got to die before we can be reborn, if you take my meaning." "We're dying, right enough. I don't see much sign of our being reborn." Ravelston rubbed his nose. "Oh well, we must have faith, I suppose, and hope." "We must have money, you mean," said Gordon gloomily. "Money?" "It's the price of optimism. Give me £5 a week and I'd be a socialist, I dare say." Ravelston looked away, discomfited. This money business, everywhere it came up against you. Gordon wished he had not said it. Money is the one thing you must never mention when you are with people richer than yourself. Or, if you do, it must be money in the abstract, money with a big M, not the actual concrete money that's in your pocket and isn't in mine. But the accursed subject drew him like a magnet. Sooner or later, especially when he had a few drinks inside him, he invariably began talking with self-pitiful detail about the bloodiness of life on 2 quid a week. Sometimes, from sheer nervous impulse to say the wrong thing, he would come out with some squalid confession, as, for instance, that he had been without tobacco for 2 days, or that his underclothes were in holes and his overcoat up the spout. But nothing of that sort should happen tonight, he resolved. They veered swiftly away from the subject of money, and began talking in a more general way about socialism. Ravelston had been trying for years to convert Gordon to socialism, without even succeeding in interesting him in it. Presently they passed a low-looking pub on a corner in a side street. A sour cloud of beer seemed to hang about it. The smell revolted Ravelston. He would have quickened his pace to get away from it, but Gordon paused. His nostrils tickled. "Christ, I could do with a drink," he said. "So could I," said Ravelston gallantly.